Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for SPEX CertIPrep's presentation on the presence of heavy metals in gourmet foods. I would like to spend a moment introducing Patricia. Patricia received her bachelor's from Rutgers University. In 1995, she joined SIBA Specialty Chemicals in the Water Treatment Division and worked as both a chemist and lab supervisor until their closure in 2001. She then took a position with Rutgers researching air pollution and air quality in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Last year, Patricia joined SPEX CertIPrep as an application scientist in our Certified Reference Materials Division and spends her time researching industry trends and developing new reference materials. Should you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the chat function, and Patricia will answer them at the end. Thanks again for your interest in this topic, and enjoy the presentation. I would also like to let everyone know that we now have a page on Facebook and LabRoots, so we look forward to you joining us on those sites. Thank you. Enjoy the presentation.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining SPEX CertIPrep's What's in Your Kitchen, the Chemical Gourmet. I want to spend a minute or two just talking about the gourmet industry. Right now, the gourmet industry is predicting that by 2012, they'll reach $96 billion in gourmet food sales. And all you have to do is start looking in your neighborhood supermarkets and on the TV Food Network and other channels to see that gourmet food and the preparation and the use of gourmet food has become a very large business. And with every day, we see more new gourmet products. So anytime you go into a gourmet food aisle, there are a few more items down that aisle that weren't there the year before. Originally, we thought of gourmet foods being high-end products like wine and spices, certain cheeses, meats, seafoods. But now you can basically consider any specialty item to be a gourmet item. And these things now include things like oils, salts, vinegars, different herbs and spices. And the gourmet food industry actually predicts that this trend of more and more gourmet items is going to increase into the next decade. So for our chemical kitchen, we decided to look at 3 products: fish, chocolate, and some specialty salts. We had 7 varieties of fish, both fresh and frozen, including some salmon, tuna, marlin, and some other game fish. In chocolate, we had both dark chocolate and milk chocolate, as well as a chocolate liqueur that we tested. And for the specialty salts, we had a whole variety of different colors, size crystals, and points of origin for our specialty salts. Our first gourmet product we're going to look at today is, of course, seafood. Now, to understand how big the seafood industry is, you have to understand the seafood industry worldwide generates tens of billions of dollars a year and employs directly about 40 million people. Indirectly, it employs about 170 million people. So between the fishermen, the grocers, and the other people in food production, you have a large portion of the world employed some way, either directly or indirectly, with seafood production. In the United States, we consume about 16 pounds of seafood per person per year. But in the world, there's a much larger capacity of 36 pounds of seafood per person per year. And in the U.S., in 2005, we spent $65 billion on seafood. So what is the big hype about seafood? What are the benefits of having seafood in your diet? Well, it's a very high-quality protein. If we look at 2 sources of protein, let's say ground beef and catfish, and we look at an 8-ounce portion, a normal portion for, let's say, dinner. For ground beef, for 8 ounces, you have about 18% protein, and it's going to cost you about 640 calories for that hamburger. If you took the same amount of catfish, again, you have about 18% protein, but you also have a much lower calorie consumption, around 230 calories. The benefit of seafood also, it's very low in sodium. So if you're on a low sodium diet, this is a very good choice for you. And it's a good source of potassium. Other benefits, which we've all heard about, is it's low in cholesterol and saturated fat, which reduces your risk of heart disease and high blood pressure. There's also been studies about the omega-3 fatty acids, which reduce cholesterol, blood pressure, reduce hardening of the arteries, And that old adage about fish making you smart, there is some studies to show that omega-3 fatty acids help promote memory retention. So what are the hazards of seafood? Well, fish absorb the contaminants in the water that they swim in, and they absorb contaminants in the food they eat. So water from pesticides and runoff from industry can contaminate the water sources and therefore contaminate the fish. The pollutants then collect in the tissues of the fish. And there are basically 4 types of pollutants that most of the time we look for. Pesticides and PCBs are 2 of the types of pollutants. And for the pesticides, they actually concentrate over 1,000 times in the tissue of the fish. And this can cause neurological and reproductive toxicity. The other 2 potential hazards in seafood are mercury and methylmercury. A study in the U.S. showed that 1 in 6 children already have high levels of mercury in their blood. These high levels of mercury have been linked to learning disabilities and brain and nervous system damages. There was a study from the Nevada reservoir that they showed that fish caught from this Nevada reservoir on average had almost half a part per million of mercury in its tissue. So what are the mercury regulations? What does the government say about this mercury in our seafood? Well, it's very difficult to find some definitive limits, and they do keep changing. The first limit was imposed by the the FDA of half a part per million in 1969. About a decade later, they actually raised that level to 1 part per million of total mercury. A decade after that, the FDA decided to stop measuring total mercury and measure instead methylmercury. And as of 1998, the FDA basically stopped testing widespread fish. So what that meant is they stopped testing the fish themselves, and they relied on the industry to actually police itself and to report the numbers of the mercury that was finding in the fish tissue. In Canada, they have a half part per million limit, and the EPA has a reference dosage of methylmercury, which is 0.1 micrograms per kilogram of body weight a day. So in order to kind of put that into perspective of what that means, if you have a 45-pound child, the limit, according to the EPA's reference dosage, is 2 micrograms a day, or 14 micrograms a week. According to sources, a 6-ounce can of tuna has approximately 53 grams total of methylmercury. So that means if you gave this child a 6-ounce can of tuna, you would be exceeding his weekly allowance over 4 times. So these are the varieties of fish that we looked at for our seafood study here. We had some fresh tuna, some fresh wild Alaskan salmon, some farm-raised organic salmon. We had some frozen tuna, some marlin steaks, swordfish steaks, and a fresh black pearl salmon. Samples of these different fish were taken and digested using high purity nitric acid, peroxide, and distilled water. After the digestion, they were diluted with more distilled water and then diluted 1 to 10 before analysis doing ICP and ICP-MS. With our ICP and our ICP-MS, we were looking for trace metals, and we were looking for major toxic metals such as mercury. We used reference materials that we create here at SPEX CertIPrep. We have some certified reference materials that I have listed here, and we use these to calibrate over the expected concentration range of our samples. We also did sample matrix matching for these standards. We also had a NIST certified standard, which we processed along with our fish and analyzed as a control. This is a table of some of the results that we found in our various fish samples. Some of these are very positive elements to have in your diet, such as calcium, iron, potassium, magnesium. And you can see that there's a wide range of results for each of these elements. And that fish in general is a very good source of things like potassium and phosphorus. There's also some different ranges of numbers for iron. This tuna has a very large amount of iron compared to this black pearl farm-raised salmon. So if you're looking for more iron in your diet, the dark tuna would have been a better choice here. If we look now just for the mercury, if we look at a typical 4-ounce serving in micrograms, we have a large range of mercury that we found in our different fish samples. Our salmons were virtually identical, between 3.5 and 5 micrograms in a 4-ounce serving. Now, if we look at the allowable daily limit of mercury, and this is based on a normal adult diet, we would be hitting about 63, almost 64% of an adult's daily serving of mercury for these different salmon samples. And it would be about between 6 and 9% for a weekly allowable daily limit, or allowable weekly limit, excuse me. But if we get down now to these marlin steaks and swordfish, the game fish, we're looking at fish that are very slow growing, they're fairly long-lived, and they have a longer chance and a better chance of these materials collecting in their tissues. You start to have much higher mercury results. In fact, the swordfish steaks had 111 micrograms in a 4-ounce serving, and the marlin steaks had way over 300 micrograms in a 4-ounce serving. So what does that mean if you're going to eat a marlin steak or you're going to eat a swordfish steak? Well, you should be aware that the percentage of your allowable daily limit for that swordfish steak will put you way over the 1,000%. So you've exceeded your daily limit by 1,000% by eating that swordfish steak. And you've exceeded your weekly limit by almost 200%. Now for marlin steaks, the news is a little worse, actually a lot worse. If you look at how much you're allowed in a daily serving of mercury, if you ate that marlin steak, you would be in the 4,000 range of how far over your daily limit you were. And in your weekly limit, you'd be close to 600% over your daily, or excuse me, your weekly limit. There's an interesting mercury calculator at this website here, and you can actually put in your weight and the type of fish you're planning on eating, and how many ounces of this fish you plan on eating this week. And according to the EPA and the FDA studies and the EPA data, it will show you how much mercury exposure, and you can create your own little table of what your percentage of your weekly limit would be. So what did we find for mercury content? Well, there were no real differences in the mercury levels between the different types of salmon. And when it comes to tuna, we found that the frozen tuna actually had higher levels of mercury than our fresh tuna. Another interesting thing that we found out about the seafood samples that we were looking at is it seemed that the higher the mercury levels we found, they were for, again, game fish or very dense type of fish, things like swordfish and marlin steaks and shark. And both of the swordfish and the marlin steaks exceeded EPA guideline limits. Going back to the tuna, imported tuna also seemed to have a higher level of mercury than U.S. tuna. And if we looked at the studies around different imported tunas, Asian tuna were the lowest of the imported tuna in regards to mercury, and Latin American tuna were the highest, and sometimes exceeding the legal limits of mercury. Now we come to the selenium paradox. Selenium is an essential element in the human diet, and when we consider that mercury is a dangerous toxic element potential in fish, we have to consider mercury alone is not just a risk indicator. There are things that can offset the mercury. There are other elements that interact with mercury, and selenium has a very high binding affinity for mercury. There was a Japanese study that showed that adding selenium to the diet of birds actually increased their protection from mercury toxicity. And as I said before, selenium is a very important mineral in the diet. It's necessary for cellular function and enzyme creation. And in the body, there is a selenium-dependent enzyme synthesis. There was a study done on Madison, Wisconsin fish that shows the different ratios that were found between the different types of fish and selenium and mercury. If we look at this one red line here, this is the 1-to-1 ratio where the levels of selenium and mercury are basically equal. And so you lose quite a bit of the protection or the effective protection of the selenium. So when you look down at this very end of the table here you find those more game fish, the mahi-mahi and the swordfish, the other dense and slow-growing fish where it had high levels of mercury to begin with, but they also have low levels of selenium. So you have this ratio which is very close to 1, and it has the least amount of protection from that selenium. If you go to the other end, you have more of these fast-growing smaller fish, the cod and the trout and the whitefish, where these ratios are much higher. We look at our own samples that we did here at SPEX CertIPrep. We found that salmon had a ratio, selenium and mercury ratio between 4 and 11. Tuna had a ratio between 3 and 10, with the Wisconsin study reporting for the similar tuna between 2 and 25. These game fish for us had a ratio of less than 1. So it shows a very low ratio between the selenium and the mercury. And in the Wisconsin study, the swordfish had a ratio of 1. So what can we conclude about seafood? Well, in regards to mercury levels, the marlin and the swordfish had the highest mercury levels, and in this case, they actually exceeded the EPA's reference dosage limits for the day. For tuna, we found that frozen tuna actually had higher levels of mercury than the fresh tuna. And imported tuna had higher levels of mercury than domestic tuna. If you were going to eat imported tuna, it was found that Asian tuna levels were the lowest of the import tunas, while South American tuna had the highest level of mercury of all the import tunas. So the health benefits of eating fish, do they outweigh the dangers? There have been many health studies that show that the benefits of eating fish actually decrease your mortality rate. So there's a statistic that mortality rate from heart disease was actually 30% lower from those eating fish twice a week than those who did not eat fish. And the overall mortality rate for those who do eat seafood was about 17% lower. So the EPA and the FDA make recommendations for fish consumption. And there's a nice little chart from the Bureau of Health Environmental Toxicity Program here, which has a little diagram of the levels of mercury in each of the different types of seafood. And down here at the bottom with very high mercury are these game fish, the swordfish and the shark, and up to the top are the shellfish and the flounder and the pollock and the cod, these smaller, lighter fish. So the FDA and the EPA advise that you avoid shark and swordfish and other types of game fish like marlin and tilefish. The alternatives are things like canned light tuna, salmon, pollock, catfish, and they suggest you eat up to 12 ounces or 2 average meals a week of seafood that is low in mercury. They also say that if you eat locally caught fish, please check your advisories for the safety of those locally caught fish. And if there is no information available, eat less than 6 ounces a week of these locally caught fish. Now we're going to move on to our second gourmet product, which was salt. Just a little history of salt. Over history, it's been considered worth its weight in gold. It was traded as a commodity. And different places around the world have gone under siege for their access to salt. There were salt roads created, paths to go to and from the salt mines. Salt was a commodity like spices were. In Roman times, Romans were given their salary, or this salarium argentinum, and I'm sorry I don't speak Latin, I'm sorry if I'm butchering it, which was basically money for salt. So the Romans were given their money or their salary for salt. And in India, Mahatma Gandhi conducted his salt march to free India from British colonial rule and the salt tax. And here in the U.S., there have been salt wars or salt ambushes to protest the control of salt. As I said before, it was used as currency. And it's also been worshipped as a divinity. And in many modern and ancient religions, salt is part of the worship service. And before the Industrial Revolution, salt mining was a very dangerous process and was involved in the slave trade because slaves were often used to mine salt. When we look about salt in biology, the human body cannot exist without salt or sodium. It controls our blood volume and our muscle contractions. It controls nervous impulses. It's one of the 4 primary electrolytes of the body. And all 4 of the cationic electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium, are available in unrefined salt. If you have too much or too little salt in your body, it can range from a huge amount of conditions from dizziness to death. If your balance of electrolytes are off, including sodium, you can easily die. So we have our 12 different gourmet salts, which differed from different crystal sizes, such as these really large black pyramid-shaped crystals to very fine powders. They ranged in different regions. We had Mediterranean salt, Australian salt, Himalayan salt, salt from France, salt from Israel. So they ranged from all over the world. They also range, as you can see by the picture, greatly in color. We had red, brown, yellow, black, gray, and we also had different sources. We had sea salts and we had mineral deposit salts. In addition to our gourmet salts, we tested plain table salt and sodium chloride reagent. And we used about 0.1 to 0.15 grams dissolved in 50 mils of water with 2% nitric acid. And then we conducted ICP-MS using our SPEX CertIPrep certified reference material as standards and calibration. This is a chart of the different salt types that we did study. We have Cyprus black salt, which is the Mediterranean sea salt, dark gray, very, very large crystals. We have very small flakes from this pink salt from Australia. So there are some river salts, some sea salts, some mineral deposits. We have brown salt here, which is a fine powder from India. And we have a French Chardonnay oak smoked salt, which is a sea salt that was been smoked in oak barrels with wine. And they have some very wet crystals that we looked at. If we look at some of the macronutrients, there was a wide range of different macronutrients we found in the salt. Now, if you start to look up the benefits of sea salt or the benefits of gourmet salt, salt purveyors will tell you that these gourmet salts are unrefined salts, which are good for you because they contain almost every element on the periodic chart. And that may be true, but we did find a very large variation between just these beneficial nutrients such as magnesium. We found a low response of 35 milligrams to kilograms to over 8,000 milligrams per kilogram. So there was a large variation. There was no real consistency on any of these particular macronutrients. Now, if we look at some of the toxic metals that we found in gourmet salts, we found that first in cadmium, there wasn't cadmium found present in, I would say, the majority of our samples. There were a few small samples that we were able to detect a small amount of cadmium, such as in this black salt, this pink crystal salt, and this gray salt. And there was actually even a little bit in our table salt. But most of the other salts, we were not able to detect any cadmium. If we look at the lead, though, every sample in our study had a small to a somewhat significant amount of lead in it. And the salts that actually did have a large amount of lead, again, were these colored salts, this black flake sea salt, this gray salt, this pink Himalayan salt again, and this gray smoked salt. Mercury we found in most of our sea salt samples or most of our gourmet salt samples. Again, the colored salts did seem to have the presence of mercury, where this black flake salt had a level of mercury with this red crystal salt, another black Hawaiian salt. Our table salt and our reagent did not have any mercury in it. And with arsenic, I'm happy to say we were unable to detect arsenic in any of our samples except for these two here, this Indian brown mineral salt and this Australian crystal pink, and even then it's a very, very small amount. And also with thallium, we had in almost every sample a small to a significant amount of thallium in our samples here. If we just look at some of the higher values, you can see some of our salt samples actually did not exceed any high values of any particular toxic metal. And these tended to be the white crystal salts, this Mediterranean white crystal salt, this Israeli white salt. There's one or two pink salts, so that did not have any significant toxic metals in them as well. The ones that did have several large quantities of toxic metals always seem to be these colored salts, the black salt, the gray salt. If we look at our elements of concern and look at the range of response we got for them, for arsenic, we at the low end didn't detect it at all to a small amount of 0.1 micrograms per gram. The same with the cadmium. We had about the same response. The most concern of this whole table is the mercury and the lead. Some of our samples didn't have any mercury in it, but on the high side we had 0.18 micrograms per gram. And for lead, we had the lowest response of 0.4 micrograms per gram and the highest response of 1.3 micrograms per gram. So what does that mean in real numbers? Well, a gram of salt is about 1/6 of a teaspoon. So if you consider an average daily serving of these salts could be from half a teaspoon to a teaspoon a day, you're talking about 3 to 6 grams of this material. And why should we be concerned about these toxic metals? Well, cadmium, lead, and mercury can cause toxicity at very low concentration. Lead is a cumulative poison that can build in your tissues and cause cancer and reproductive toxicity. Cadmium can cause joint pain, high blood pressure, kidney and liver damage. Arsenic can cause skin cancer and liver and kidney failure. And mercury, which is considered to be the most toxic of the heavy metals, can cause tiredness, loss of appetite, and brain damage. So how much are we allowed? Now, these calculations are for an average adult. The calculations for children would be based on their weight. For a 6-gram daily serving, which is about that 1 teaspoon mark of salt, the highest varieties we found, you would have received about 0.6 micrograms of arsenic. Now, the allowable daily limit for arsenic is 130 micrograms. So in this one serving, you would have about 0.5% arsenic level. For cadmium, again, we have about 0.6 micrograms in that 6-gram serving. Your allowable daily limit is 55 micrograms. So you would have a little bit more. You'd have maybe 1.25% of your allowable daily limit. Again, as long as you're careful with your diet, that's probably not too big of a deal. The problem comes in when we start looking at the mercury and lead levels. The highest mercury sample we found in a 6-gram sample, about 1.1 micrograms, and your allowable daily limit is only 8 for mercury. So you would be having in that just a little bit of salt, you would have about 12% of your allowable daily limit just from that salt you put on your fish or your chicken. For lead, also, we found in our highest concentration about 8 micrograms. With an allowable daily limit of 50 micrograms, you would get about 16% of your allowable daily limit from that salt. So what does that mean? How does that compare to other foods? Well, if we look at this list of foods here provided by the FDA and the EPA, these are different quantities that have been found of lead in different types of foods. I've just highlighted a few of interest here. Wine, if you have that glass of wine, you're going to be getting about 0.8 micrograms serving of lead. If you have some canned applesauce, you might have about 0.85 micrograms of lead. And if you have this particular brand that they tested of 2% milk, you're going to have about 0.9 micrograms of lead in your diet from that. Now, how much lead is too much? Well, federal standards say tolerable total daily intake for adults is 75 micrograms a day. For pregnant women, it's about 25 micrograms a day. And then, but for children, if they're over 7, it's 15 micrograms, and for children under 6, it's 6 micrograms. In California, there was Proposition 65, where they were trying to limit the total lead intake to under 50 micrograms total. And they were also trying to further limit that any one product could not have more than 0.5 micrograms a day. So what did we find with our gourmet salt? Well, in our 1 teaspoon daily serving, we found between 2.4 and 8.1 micrograms, which would have clearly violated the California Proposition 65 for an individual product. What conclusions do we find about our gourmet salt? Well, each of the brands contains some toxic elements. It showed that the gray salts had the highest lead levels, and the brown salts tended to have the highest mercury levels. We had 1 pink salt that also showed some cadmium levels. And if you're looking at 1 teaspoon serving, you could be up to 12% of your mercury level and 16% of your lead level. We also found that these salts had a lot of beneficial nutrients, macronutrients such as iron, magnesium, and potassium. Now we're going to look at everybody's favorite product and our favorite gourmet product, chocolate. Here's some fun facts about chocolate. Chocolate, or cocoa, has been in existence since 600 BC. Mayans used cocoa beans as currency. So if you were in the Mayan culture, you would probably never taste chocolate, or very rarely ever taste chocolate in your life, because it was usually reserved for the rich, the powerful, and the rulers. Now, Carl Linnaeus was the father of modern taxonomy, and he gave chocolate its name, cocoa, which meant food of the gods. And it's, of course, the #1 favorite candy in the world. If we look at consumption around the world, Americans eat about 12 pounds a year. The British have a slightly bigger sweet tooth, which I find surprising, at 16 pounds a year. And then finally, the Swiss eat about 21 pounds a year of chocolate. In 2000, the chocolate industry reported sales of $8.6 billion in the United States. So why study chocolate, besides it being a really fun topic? It is very complex. The chemistry and physics of chocolate is a complex science which whole courses are taught about. And I'm pretty sure that any science teacher who has to show a class of students the concepts of physics and chemistry will find chocolate a great way to get their students interested in chemistry and physics. In May of 2002, there was a suit brought against the chocolate manufacturers for violating California's Proposition 65. They claimed that their labels did not disclose chemicals that could cause cancer or birth defects like cadmium and lead. So what is the science of chocolate? Chocolate has a crystal structure. That's what gives it its rigidity and its snap. So when you open up a bar of chocolate, it has a good snap to it. Molten chocolate is tempered, and this will produce seed crystals, and there are more than 6 different types of crystal phases associated with chocolate. The most desirable form is form 5. This is the form of chocolate that has a melting point of just about 33 degrees C, just under body temperature, so you get that lovely melt in your mouth when you put a piece of chocolate in your mouth. There is another form that most consumers are familiar with. That's form 6. If you've ever opened up a chocolate bar and you've seen this kind of white haze on top of your chocolate bar and it kind of tastes a little stale, that's probably form 6. It's a very dense, very stable form of chocolate, but it's not really desirable. It happens when the fat is forced to the surface and it causes it to bloom. So if you've ever heard somebody say that the chocolate has bloomed, this is what's happened. The fat has been forced to the surface. Going on into the chemistry of chocolate, chocolate is a complex emulsion. It has cocoa, sugar, fat, minerals, and over 800 different chemical compounds. And there's a list of the different compounds, including metals and lecithins. And in our study of chocolate, we wanted to concentrate on the various metals. We had 6 chocolate varieties. We had 3 milk chocolate, 3 dark chocolate, and a chocolate liqueur, which we studied. And we examined them for the major and trace elements by ICP, ICP-MS. We took our chocolate pieces and we weighed them into flasks and Teflon beakers and digested them with nitric acid. Then we diluted with more nitric acid and ran them by ICP and ICP-MS. And again, we used our SPEX CertIPrep certified reference materials to tune and calibrate our system. And again, here is the list of the compounds if anybody's interested. So what did we find? We found a very large range of different compounds in our chocolate, some desirable, some not so desirable. We have here magnesium. So chocolate is a very large source of magnesium here. We have 20,000 micrograms to 60,000 micrograms of magnesium in our chocolate. There's a large source of potassium and calcium. There's some iron in some of our samples. There's definitely phosphorus and sulfur and sodium. There's also a few things that are not so good for us. There's aluminum from 400 to 1,200 micrograms. And there was some nickel from 37 to 115 micrograms. If we start looking at the toxic metals in chocolate, we're talking about a 40-gram serving or so. And we have 3 brands of chocolate, dark chocolate, and 3 brands of milk chocolate and a chocolate liqueur. If we look at the dark chocolate, most of our high numbers for our toxic metals occurred in the dark chocolate. All 3 of the dark chocolate brands had high levels of cadmium or had the higher values of cadmium that we saw. 2 of ours had the higher values of lead, and 2 of them also had some significant values for mercury. If we look at the milk chocolate, there are 1 or 2 standouts. There was a actually the highest value of mercury was in this one particular milk chocolate brand, and one of the higher values of lead was in this one brand 5 of milk chocolate. If we look at the liqueur, though, all the values for all these toxic elements are some of the lowest that we saw. So how does this compare? Again, we bring back our allowable daily limits. And if we look at the cadmium level, we're allowed 55 micrograms, and we found between 1 and 5 micrograms in a 40-gram sample. So that means in that 40-gram sample, you'd be getting between 2 and 9% of your allowable daily limit of cadmium. For lead, again, we have between 0.8 and 3 micrograms, which would give you between 2 and 6% of your allowable daily limit. For arsenic, you fare a little bit better. Your allowable daily limit is 130 micrograms, and we saw between 0.3 and 1 microgram. So you would have between 0.2 and less than 1% of your allowable daily limit. The problem comes with the mercury here. Mercury has a very low allowable daily limit for an adult, and again, these are results compared for an adult. In some of our samples, we were unable to detect mercury, but in our highest sample, we saw 4 micrograms of mercury. So you could have between 0 and 50% of your mercury limit just from chocolate. And as I said before, dark chocolate had the most toxic metals, but we did find toxic metals in all of our brands. There is CERLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, which designates an order of toxicity of the substances that are the most potential threat to human health. And among those are arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium, and chromium, which we did find amounts of in our samples. So what does this mean for chocolate and children? Because children seem to be the ones who consume quite a bit of chocolate, especially in this country. Well, if you had a 5-year-old and you gave them a small single serving of chocolate pieces, you would find approximately 1.4 micrograms of lead, which is higher than the total daily consumption of lead that they are allowed from all sources. If you gave a 6-year-old a dark chocolate bar, it's estimated that his blood level of lead would increase up to 21%. And the EPA has stated that for every microgram of lead a child ingested, if their blood level raises by 0.16 microgram per deciliter, that 1 microgram per deciliter increase in blood concentration equals a loss of 1/4 of an IQ point or more. So why are there toxic metals in chocolate? Toxic metals are in the soil. The metals come from different fertilizers and different runoff from industry and are absorbed by the cocoa plants, and then they go and concentrate in the beans. Mercury, cadmium, and lead depend on a lot of conditions, the soil being one of them. It's been found that cadmium in the Central American cocoa is higher than the cadmium levels in African cocoa. And if you look at different types of fertilizers and pesticides, in Africa, like the Ivory Coast and Ghana, they use fertilizers which are contaminated with heavy metals, which then concentrate in the plants themselves. And finally, there are alkalizing agents, agents they use to treat and process the cocoa, which may have heavy metals in it. So what are our conclusions when we look at chocolate? Well, we did find toxic metals in all our chocolate samples. We also found some not so desirable metals like aluminum, nickel, and cobalt in our chocolate samples. But we also found a lot of essential minerals such as calcium, magnesium, potassium, copper, iron, which were in high quantities in our chocolate samples. And finally, there was a note that there was a petition by the American Environmental Safety Institute that they requested the FDA to establish a limit for lead and cadmium in cocoa products. They want that limit to be set to 2 micrograms per kilogram. So what's cooking in our chemical kitchen? Well, we found toxic metals were present in many of the gourmet foods we examined. But we also, on the other side, found a lot of beneficial elements such as the potassium and the iron. And it did seem to be like in any other food choice you make in your life, the choices of your food item and the portion size that you choose to have affect your exposure level. So I wanted to give a little scenario of our most toxic gourmet dinner we're serving up here. This is for an average adult. This is not considered to be for a children's weight. But for an average adult from 170 to 180 pounds, you start with a glass of wine and you'll get about 0.8 micrograms of lead. Then you have your nice swordfish for dinner, and 4 ounces of that swordfish, a 1/4 of a pound, you're going to have about 111 micrograms of mercury. If you sprinkle a little bit of salt on top of your vegetables and on top of that fish, one of these salts that we use in our gourmet study can have up to 1/2 microgram of mercury and 4 micrograms of lead. Then you're going to finish with some nice dark chocolate, about 2.5 ounces of dark chocolate, and you're going to end up with 8 micrograms of mercury and 6 micrograms of lead. So what's the grand total? For your total meal, you'll end up with 11 micrograms of lead, or just about 22 to 25% of your daily allowance, so 1/4 of your daily allowance of lead for your meal in one dinner. And you're going to have 119 micrograms of mercury, Well, because of that swordfish, you now are over 1,400% above your daily limit of mercury for the day, and you're about 200% or over your weekly daily limit of mercury. Just a little disclaimer, this study was not intended to designate any safety or purities of any products. We only studied the particular elements I've mentioned here today. And all the sources and samples we studied were not representative of all the types of samples that are there for fish, chocolate, salt, or other brands. And we're not intending this study to advise or warn against any particular brand or any particular product. If you would like our references, you can call SPEX and the numbers on the screen, or you can send us an email at crmsales@spexcsp.com. And you can also take a look at some of our other studies that we have on our website, including our last webinar topic in April, which was the analysis of laboratory and consumer water sources for the presence of BPA and phthalates. And that is available for download on our website. Are there any questions? Okay, do we have any questions? Okay, we have a question here. Are fish oils as safe or safer than eating seafood? Well, we did do at the same time, we did do a study on some fish oil supplements. We found that the fish oil supplements had quite a few of the beneficial elements and not as many of the toxic elements. So other reports do show that the omega-3 fatty acids are actually in the fish oil as well as the fish. So you can actually take fish oil supplements and get the same benefit. Any other questions? So we have a question, what can we eat? Well, everybody can eat anything they want. I'm not going to designate any particular food that somebody should be eating. Just like any nutritionist will tell you, you can eat anything in moderation. You just should be aware of what is in your food and what quantities this should be found in. So if you do have a concern about mercury, you should take that into consideration when making your food choice. Okay. What is methylmercury, and should it be tested as consumed, cooked? Is this an argument against sushi? Well, methylmercury is a chemical complex of mercury, which is often formed in the presence of water. So there are many mercury compounds which actually can complex into methylmercury. Should the fish be tested and consumed and cooked? For the most part, mercury is not always destroyed in the process of cooking or being consumed as sushi. So the best answer is that you have to assume that the level of mercury is going to be the same in whether you cook your fish or whether you use it as sushi. So you should just be aware that this is the level determined in the fish and make your decisions from there, and not have cooking or sushi as a way of trying to make a decision on which fish you should eat. And when can we download this presentation? The presentation is on our website, and you will be able to download it anytime you want. Are there any other questions?
We would like to thank everyone for attending and hope that you found this presentation interesting and informative. Everyone in attendance will receive a 10% coupon off any one Claritas ICP MS standard. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link to a short survey where we will request feedback on your experience. Everyone who fills out this brief survey will receive a BPA-free SPEX CertIPrep stainless steel water bottle. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you again in a future webinar.